Welcome back to part 2 of Show Me the Money for everybody who was here in March for part 1. If you didn't get a chance to be with us in March, I hope you'll either take the opportunity to listen to part 1 after this, or perhaps you got to hear it before. We are going to touch on just a couple of the big takeaways from part 1, but we want to move pretty quickly into the new material and be respectful of everyone's time. So hope that you'll take that chance as soon as you have it. Let me, if you will, reintroduce myself to those folks who were with us in March and say hi to all the new folks that are with us this time. I've been with Best Friends Animal Society about a year, which is just about as long as our team has been in existence. We are the shelter outreach team, and we call ourselves Team 2025 because of that acronym that you see. The things that we do out across the nation and different communities are listed there in our bullets. We are, to a great extent, a support group for the regional teams. We are informed by their work and they are informed by ours. So in addition to those things that you see bulleted there, we also create many online resources, and we work through other teams at Best Friends to create resources. If you aren't familiar with those, don't know where to find those, please check in with your regional specialist. Every region in the country has one, and that person will be happy to help you find resources. If you don't know who your regional specialist is, we've got a link here at the bottom where you can go to our national map, and you'll be able to find who that person is. A great contact no matter where you are in the evolution of your organization's life cycle. So let me just touch on a couple of big takeaways from part 1, because we want to tie that to some of our material that we're going to be talking about today. We talked about sources of money in part 1. We know it doesn't grow on trees. We're all looking for it. We're asking our donors to show us the money day in, day out. But where does that money really come from? It comes basically from 3 sources: individuals, corporations, and foundations. That's certainly true of private funding, meaning non-governmental funding, but it's also true of public funding. And some folks I meet don't think about it. They think about, well, that's the government, we're accountable to government, whether that's state or federal or local, and that's true. But it also helps to remember that public funding comes from taxes and fees, and who's being taxed, who's being charged the fee: individuals, corporations, and foundations. So seeing through that kind of layer of accountability to where the money's really coming from helps us make some more well-informed decisions than we might otherwise. Another big takeaway from talking about sources of revenue is that the strongest fundraising programs, regardless of where you are the ones that are diversified, ones that don't rely on 1 or 2 sources of revenue, on 1 or 2 strategies for reaching out and acquiring that revenue, but programs that are built with each of these in mind. The thing that many people don't realize, though, is that individuals far and away constitute the greatest amount of money in American philanthropy. Most recent figures that we have show that 79% of American philanthropic dollars come from individuals, 70% from living individuals, and another 9% from individuals who are deceased, but who've left us in their wills or maybe in their retirement plans. So even though we want to try to build fundraising programs that respect all 3 sources of revenue, we really need to make sure that we're building those rich, robust, individual giving programs, not relying just on foundation grants, because there's so much more we can do with that individual giving over time. The other thing that we talked about in part 1 were 5 fundamentals that I see as necessary for any organization to ultimately succeed in fundraising, whether you're a 3-person rescue or a very large municipality or anything in between. Yes, you can raise some money without having all of these fundamentals in place, but over time, as you begin to have more complex work, more complex programs, to be able to really determine what went well and how you can replicate it or how you need to upgrade it, or if something does go wrong, how to fix what went wrong. Usually those issues come down to 1 or more of these 5 fundamentals. So we talked about the importance of having not just a mission, but a vision. And the difference is essentially that the mission answers the question, why do we exist? The vision answers the question, how will the world be different? What will be different? How will we be different when we succeed in our mission? And you need that vision because that's the dream. That's the big exciting thing that energizes people, that makes them feel something is coming, that there's a problem, it will really be solved, and it unites people. So vision, very important to know it, to articulate it, and to disseminate it throughout all of your community and your supporters. We talked about the importance of leadership, not just executive leadership in terms of CEO or founder, but fundraising leadership. Someone who is really looking both in the mirror at the organization and out the window at the community and thinking every day, how do we do a better job of giving our prospective donors the kind of experiences that will really keep them coming back and feeling good about their gifts over time. We talked about looking out the window. And basically that just means taking a really good objective look at your community. Where are the markets and where are the prospects? And what we mean by that is when you look out at markets, I, for instance, grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. When I look at Memphis, I know where the neighborhoods are. I know where different value clusters are. I know how people get their info, where they go, what they do, how they use their spare time. I basically can think about Memphis in terms of different markets. Then I can drill past those group characteristics that create markets and think about specific prospects, specific individuals, specific corporations, specific foundations that I think might be willing to give to my cause. Once I've done that kind of brain work, and make no mistake, it is brain work, but it is worthwhile brain work, I can then roll those up into finally the fifth fundamental, which is an action plan that tells not only me, but everyone who's involved what we're going to be doing, when we're going to be doing it, and who's accountable for that. And that action plan can be a multi-page document, or it can be back of the napkin. But writing that plan down helps you avoid so many distractions. So I've heard a lot of people say, well, my plan is in my head. By all means, it's worth taking an hour, getting the plan out of one's head and getting onto something that can be shared. Our wrap up for part one was essentially to get that money. We want to identify our best sources. We want to have a diversified fundraising program, but we can't work on everything all at once. So identifying those best sources and beginning to build those programs and then diversify as you get strong in one or two programs is a great way to go. Strengthening those 5 fundamentals. Where do you need to upgrade what you're doing now? If you want more detail on that, check out part 1 of what we did last month. And then use the fundraising process, which is what we're going to talk about today. Now, I know we probably have some really seasoned veterans on the phone who say, wow, you know, this process, I've seen this diagram before. You have, you absolutely have. And the good news for everybody is that this is not rocket science. But for those that are coming to it as seasoned fundraisers, here's a challenge that I offer to a lot of people. Once a year, take every fundraising program that you have, sit down with your best list makers, your best creative thinkers, and walk each program, each fundraising program, whether it's an event, whether it's a mail program, whether it's some type of digital program, walk that program through each of the stages of this process and ask, are we really doing the very best job we can in this particular stage for this particular program? You'll be surprised at some of the insights that cuts loose. And the other filter to use is not just, well, the best we can, we're going to evaluate that based on the money we raise, yes, but also add the caveat, are we doing the best we can for our donors in this stage? What does this stage feel like to them? That also will cut loose some insights that you might not have just working day to day. For those folks that are new to this process, who perhaps have not seen this diagram before, this is a classic fundraising diagram. I don't use a lot of those. I don't use a lot of jargon because fundraising to me is essentially relationship building. And there's a lot of common sense involved in relationship building. And I've seen people without any formal fundraising training do a great job just because they were super common sense oriented and then they added some creativity to that. So I would encourage you to start thinking about the stages of fundraising as stages of relationship building, and think about a relationship in your own life that is with a friend of many years, not a spouse or a child or anyone who has a family relationship, but a friend that you met at some point in the past, distant past, near past, but you've got several years of being friends together. Think about what you normally don't think about, which is how that friendship evolved. At some point, you identified each other. Might have been a shared activity, might have been a shared interest, maybe a shared value, but usually not something that deep. Perhaps you just ended up in the same place at the same time. But something happened that made you interested in each other, made you want to know more about each other. So you kind of develop these unconscious hypotheses. I think Logan might be a good friend to have. I don't know, she's really interested in dogs and I'm interested in dogs, and maybe we could take our dogs to the park together. So you start to do some things. You have more conversations. You might find out that once you talk a little more, get to know each other a little more, you've qualified. Yes, I used to believe this might be a friend. Now I'm pretty sure this person will be a friend, as opposed to just a casual acquaintance. So now that we both kind of got that feeling about each other, we start to do things together. We don't think about it consciously, strategically, as I'll now cultivate my friend, but we begin to have experiences that make us bond, that make that relationship go broader, that go deeper. And then at some point in time, one of us will ask for something. Hopefully it won't be money as the first thing, but think about that. At some point, you ask for a favor. Would you keep my dogs for a week? Would you pick up my kids? Or vice versa. Maybe it's something a little deeper. Maybe it's something you're asking for that requires trust, or something that requires confidentiality. Whatever that is, if the other person says yes, that relationship takes a step. It may be a tiny leap, it may be a big leap, but now you're on a different level. And you, as a wonderful and grateful person, once that individual said yes, you'll say thank you. It's just natural, right? Depending on what you ask and what they did or said, you might say thank you more than once. You might say thank you in another way. You might decide that this is something you will always remember, and so you'll always be willing to say thank you in different ways. By then, you have moved through what's really the solicitation process to stewardship. And if you then step back and start thinking about this process consciously, strategically, you know what you need to do in terms of prospective donors and fundraising programs. Well, take it a little bit deeper. How do we get to each one of those stages in the process? I mentioned getting together all your list makers and your creative thinkers at least once a year to talk through your programs. Here are some of the questions I suggest that people ask when they start looking at, are we doing the best we can at identifying prospective donors to give to our particular cause? And there are a couple of things I want to call out about one or two of these bullets. I want to encourage you to think beyond the folks who think like us, look like us, talk like us. And by that I mean think outside folks that you believe are the hardcore companion animal lovers. I'm still surprised that some of my colleagues at Best Friends are surprised that many of my conservation colleagues are as strongly in favor of animal care issues as they are. That seems like a no-brainer to me, because many of us actually came to conservation thinking about animals, not about great spaces and places and pretty parks and all that type of thing, but thinking about wild animals. And if you know anything about wild animals and love them, the best thing you can do is protect their habitat. So that's just a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking. A little more out-of-the-box thinking. Where do we find companion animals? We find them in connection to children, in some cases children's treatment centers, children's hospitals. We find them in communities where there are veterans programs. Think about what groups of people beyond just our true believers, so to speak, have a connection with animals that goes beyond an ordinary connection, and that begins to help you identify who might care, who might be identified as a prospective donor for your cause. In that fourth bullet, I mentioned whose care is essential to success, tying that back to our vision. If we don't have a well-articulated vision, it's going to be really hard to define and describe what success looks like in a way that's broad enough to embrace a lot of different people who will all come together under the umbrella. So that vision is really important when you start to consider that particular question. And the final bullet, we can never talk enough in nonprofit fundraising about ethics and transparency, because as you probably already know, we are now under as much scrutiny as anybody in the corporate or governmental world. That was not true when I started in fundraising. There were assumptions that were made about the ethics and transparency of nonprofits that we just can't count on today. So in part one, if this is a new issue to you, in part one we talked about the Association of Fundraising Professionals and their donor bill of rights, and we gave you a link to that. Please be sure that you check that out and make some decisions, whatever they are. Make some decisions about what commitment your organization has to ethics and transparency. And even better than making those decisions is writing them down where your donors can actually access that when they need to. Once we've asked those questions and answers start to emerge, we'll see that the answers come in terms of groups. And these are some of the groups of people that we might be identifying as potentially willing to donate to our cause. We're also going to be doing some tasks. So when you're thinking about individuals as groups, these are some of the activities we become engaged in. Constantly thinking, how can we do a better job at collecting information? Particularly because we know social media platforms don't always allow us to see through the platform to some type of address where we can contact people. So thinking through our own websites, our own events, our storefronts, if we have a storefront, how can we constantly motivate people and give them an opportunity? I see some websites, for instance, where you have one shot to sign up for the newsletter. Yesterday, I happened to be looking at one in the Great Plains area. It was beautiful. Every single drop down on their fundraising portion of their website gave you another opportunity to sign up for that newsletter. So they clearly have got collecting information on their mind. At some point, you're going to be segmenting those groups into smaller groups. You might just start out segmenting by zip code so you get a handle on where most of the gifts that you're getting are coming from. But sooner or later, you'll want to start analyzing that past giving of people. You want to look at recency of gift and frequency of gift and who increased their gift in the last couple of years. Who shows one of those patterns of not giving for a couple of years and coming back? You might test some things, and you're always analyzing results. The most successful annual giving director I ever hired was a guy who walked in my office one day and said, I just love sending things out and seeing what I get back. And he was so excited to be doing that. And that's the kind of energy and focus that you really want in anyone, volunteer or staff, who's going to be doing this type of work for you. When you move from looking at people as groups to looking specifically at individuals, this is going to require brain work of a different type and activities and skills of a different type. You're going to do more qualifying with them. Qualification is that step where we go from having a hypothesis or belief about someone to either confirming or correcting it. And I always tell people, if you don't do these things, if you don't test for capacity, access and interest, you really just have a suspect. I see some folks who want to skip that step of qualification, but then down the road when they get a no, when they go to make an ask and solicit someone, sometimes what is behind that no is that we fail to qualify these folks to determine if they really were interested in what we do, or perhaps we didn't do a good job of access and really getting in and helping them see what we do and learning more about them and what they're interested in before we made the ask. So access and interest, often you learn when you're doing email or you're doing other types of digital fundraising or print. This process will be pretty quick. It'll be compacted. So you may put together an email package or a direct mail package, send that out, and essentially if I respond to you, I'm more or less self-qualified. So that's fine. You're not looking to create steps in this process, but you are looking to create enough steps that the donor is moving through that process, albeit unconsciously. With foundations, they're certainly going to self-qualify because so many of them have missions, they have giving guidelines, some you have to ferret out, but most are published. If you don't have that with the foundation or a corporation, or in many cases you won't have it with individuals of higher giving capacity, there's where you turn to your board members. If fundraising is a part of their mandate, I know for some municipal boards it's not, but they will still know things about the community. Or if you don't have a board or don't have a board engaged in fundraising, other community leaders. We don't have to put everybody who could be a leader on the board. In fact, I think sometimes we ought to give people smaller projects and see how they feel about it, how that works out before we immediately default to asking them to be on the board. They can help you gain access. If they're not willing to help you gain access to that particular individual of affluence, they may be able to tell you some things about that individual that help you gain access. The one thing I really want to encourage folks, though, is if you cannot get access any other way and you can't make that nice warm visit where someone has introduced you, don't let that put you off completely. Often finding out about real interest is best done face-to-face. And if you need to be the one to make that cold call, see if you can get that appointment and get in that office or living room, do it. You'll be amazed. You'll have more yeses than nos ultimately if you take the steps then to cultivate the person and learn more about them. So let's say we've qualified someone. Let's say that I am moving towards trying to establish a relationship with a particular couple that I met at the dog park. And I'm learning more about them. And I've now gotten access. That wasn't hard. I didn't have to go through anybody to get that access. We see each other often enough. I've had a few preliminary conversations. They're interested in doing more for animals. They don't quite know how. They're been running their own business for a while. They're thinking about at some point selling the business and retiring, but that's not imminent. And I know that they do some giving perhaps to whatever their religious institution is and a few other charitable things in town, but they really haven't made many gifts or they haven't talked about any other animal care and welfare group. So I'm really trying, as I begin to try to deepen this relationship with them, is to follow Stephen Covey's habits, 7 habits I think he had, of highly successful people. One of those was seek first to understand, then to be understood. Sometimes we're so eager to share what we do and how important it is that we jump right to the, I want you to understand this, because I know when you do understand it, you'll want to give. It's never a mistake to take the time to try to understand someone as fully as possible. We all have that inner need to hear, I see you, I get you, I appreciate you as a fully rounded person, 360 in all your roles in life. Before we move on to the, let me tell you about what I do and what it is that I would like you to do. This way we can personalize the outreach. As you know, those of you that have been working in fundraising, personalization is so much more than just using somebody's name and spelling it correctly in the salutation of a letter or an email. It really is, the further you go up the pyramid of affluence, the more it is about really deepening that relationship over time, understanding the motivations, and then considering return on investment. I put that as my last bullet, and I put my picture here. This is my little friend Umpa, who was at the cat nursery in LA when I was there, and Umpa's getting something that she really, really loved, which is an oxygen bath. It really helped her breathe far more effectively. And it's just there as a reminder for me that that oxygen bath was fabulous. It took staff time, and we can't give every single prospect the time and attention that we were giving to Umpa here because we just don't have the bandwidth to do it. So even as you hear me talking about deepening things and making it personal and putting all this energy and work into it, you still have to step back and say, okay, is what we're putting into this worth what we think we will ultimately achieve, both for ourselves and for the donor? When you think about what you're going to be doing, back to those tasks and activities that we talked about in identification, there are a lot of those we're going to do as cultivation. And this is really fun. I think it's really fun to sit down at least once a year, maybe twice a year, and look at what are all the possibilities to connect with the couple. Let's call them Mr. and Mrs. B. So thinking about Mr. and Mrs. B, everything we've already got planned this year, where might they go that we'll be doing something? What are the opportunities we already have? What are the opportunities we're going to create? What do we know about them that would help inform what we create? What do we know about the nature of the relationship they want with us? Do they like being considered an insider? Do they love being able to come into our particular facility and have everybody know them by first name? Or do they want to be an expert? Do they really, really want to understand dog enrichment and kind of be known among their circle as somebody who understands those kinds of things? Do they have, I should really mention the cats too. I did have the picture of Umpa, but my cat friends are going to be angry if I don't balance this out. So just thinking about dogs, cats, rabbits, all the different variety of animal that you may be working with and trying to help, and thinking through where that connects as well. We have so many tactics to ask. And the only thing I really want to emphasize on that is that we need to ask. We need to never assume that people will give, even if we've cultivated really, really well, unless we ask. The only time not to ask is if you know, and I do know one donor in all my years of fundraising, I know one donor that we knew enough about to know you never ask. You showed up with the project. If he was interested, he would ask you what the price tag on that project was. And if you gave him the price tag and he thought that was good, he would fund the entire project by himself. So that one, there's always an exception to every rule, and you may find one. But by and large, people in the United States say the number one reason that they do not give is they were not asked. So we want to make sure that we're not the ones who fail to ask. I know I was hammering earlier on seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I was talking about that very first part of really making sure we understand who we're talking to in terms of prospective donors. But let's talk about for a minute, then you get to be understood. So in cultivation, we want to tell our story. We have many, many stories, but we have the overall story of our work and the difference that's making in the world. And I have to say that I get a little worried sometimes. I've always been a storyteller, and I've always been a story listener. And I love to hear new stories, and I love to see story really coming into its own and be recognized as something that's so critical to nonprofit work. I get a little worried now that it's so ubiquitous that we've lost sight sometimes of what a story really means. I get some publications and it's just kind of a recital of facts. And so I share with you something that a storyteller told me a long time ago. He said, you know, the king died is a fact. The king died and the queen died of a broken heart is a story. At least it's the germ of a story. Because a story has a beginning and a middle and an end. It has heroes. It has obstacles, challenges, it has the moving through, overcoming those obstacles, and it has resolution. So when you start to think about each part of your process and each part of each fundraising program that you have, take a look at the way you're telling your stories, and also add the filter of capacity. You know, I consider myself an annual donor, monthly donor, like many of your donors that perhaps make up your very foundation of your giving. I'm not a person of affluence, and I don't expect that my gift is going to change the course of any particular major thing. I just want to be part of a great story. So the way that the organizations that ask me for money tell me that story in terms of telling me the potential difference that I can by consolidating my gift with others, that's going to be really important to me. If I were a person of great affluence, accustomed to having control and influence, my motivation might be slightly different. I've worked with a lot of major donors, and by major donor, I mean people who frankly are at the stop and think about it level of giving. If you come to me and you ask me for $10, I don't have to stop and think about it. That's not a major gift for me. If you come and ask me for $1,000, I'm gonna have to stop and think about it. Because frankly, if I give you 1,000, that 1,000 is 1,000, it's not going somewhere else. So we create that label internally of major donor based on our organizations and based on our communities. But when you start to see people who fit whatever profile you have of a major donor, those are usually people that can make a major difference. They're used to impacting the world and they want to impact your story. So they're great donor prospects for launching a program, taking a program to scale, taking a program into a new neighborhood. Think as you talk to them and cultivate them about ways that you can help them impact the story. And finally, I'll say if you are lucky enough to have high net worth individuals, people who are capable of giving 7 figures as opposed to, I tend to think of major donors in that high 5-figure and 6-figure category. But again, it's all relevant, all relative based on your community. Those folks are not going to wait for us to come to them with our story. They are writing their own story. And if, however, we're able to help them execute on that, we're able to position ourselves as an organization doing the kind of work that helps them write their story, that's another way of thinking about telling stories. That's very different from the first two in terms of nuances, but it's very effective. Finally, final word on cultivation. Just want to mention that stories and stats are the real power combination. You can see on the example I have on the left, best friends, we talk a lot about data. We know data is important. It informs our work. But on this little map here where we talked in an adjacent article about all the statistics, we pulled out one story from each different area just to keep that in front of people, just to keep that emotional connection, even as we talked about the statistics, which are more of a head argument, a logic argument. In the middle, you have a very local example. This is from my neighborhood in North Carolina. It's an invitation to a party on the right, which is actually a solicitation: buy a ticket, come to our party, support the animals. But they also included this lovely little insert on the left. That's a form of cultivation. Even if I hadn't bought a ticket, they still took this opportunity to tell me some great stories, to tell me some happy endings. And then if you can read the print at the very bottom, it said, made possible by your donation. And this is one thing that I say to people about language. Language matters. And we'll talk just a bit about that in a moment. The example on the right is from a multi-page document. It's from Montpelier, which is the home of James Madison, one of our former presidents. And what these guys did that I love to call out is they had a match. I don't know how many folks have used challenge matches, but that's certainly a great tool to bring in order to get people excited to set a deadline. These guys had a challenge match, and they told some stories adjacent to this, but they also used their statistics to call out how many new donors, how many lapsed donors renewed. So this was a way of telling their story that was in conjunction with something that was a fundraising tool, and that was a slightly different but very effective thing, I think. So I'm going to pause there before we go into the hairy, scary part of solicitation, and just ask if there's anybody out there with any questions at this point, or if you have some cultivation activities that you thought were particularly successful and wanted to share those.
All right, and as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can type them into that questions box there, and it'll pop up so that we are able to let Trish know, and hopefully we can get some answers for you.
And we do love to hear your examples. If somebody has a great way of identifying or a great cultivation tool, or you have a comment about qualification, let us know. Yeah. And that's true even after the call is over. We love to get those ideas and share them.
And we're not having any of them pop in yet, but maybe let's give it just a little longer in case someone's currently typing. Well, I think, Trish, you probably did an awesome job of explaining, and it looks like everyone's ready to jump into the second part. Of course, if one comes in at the last second, we will be able to address it at the end of the presentation as well. So do feel free to plug in any questions or examples as Trish was explaining.
Okay, thank you, Rhea. On we go. Talking about solicitation. Back to my main reason why people don't give is they aren't asked. So I'll say again, Doesn't matter how we ask as long as it's appropriate to the level of gift, but somebody's got to do the asking. So I put a few bullets in here just to remind folks, particularly folks that aren't dealing with fundraising every day. I hope maybe there's 1 or 2 board members out there that might be involved. And the only one that I really want to call out is the last one, practicing. Asking for money is not a natural behavior for most of us. We usually don't have training in that. We don't grow up doing it unless we've been involved in a particular situation where that came along. So please take some time to practice and practice out loud. Things don't sound in our heads like they do when we actually speak them. If you're going to be asking with a partner, make sure that you practice with that partner so that you know who's saying what when they're saying it, who's going to address questions from the donor, and then maybe you brainstorm before you go what are going to be the questions that this person might ask or institution representative, and what might be some of the tough questions, and who's going to handle that and how you're going to handle them. Language does matter, whether we're doing something digitally or in print or face-to-face. Just a couple of examples of what I mean by that. I love this example from our friends in El Paso. When I tore off something where I was going to give, the backside said, "We heard you saved a life." So they've already put me in the story as a hero. And that, how different is that from this envelope that I got recently from another organization? I'm not going to say the name, but essentially it's time to renew your membership. That sounds a lot like my AT&T bill, and do not bend. Now, that may work for some folks. There may be some folks that want the kind of relationship with the group they give to that is straightforward. Tell me when it's time to renew. That's basically it. So I'm not saying this is a bad tactic at all, but this organization has been sending me this same package for several years, and I have never responded. So it's time for them to take a look at that list, to look at the recency and frequency, and take me off that list, or at least try a new way of approaching me. On the right hand, we have a great example from our friends down in Tucson. This was a brochure for their $5 million comprehensive campaign, but the principle is applicable to anything that you put together. And what I love about this is they put some thought into adjectives and nouns. So exceptional veterinary care, not just veterinary care. Animal care excellence, not just animal care. And this is not fluff, because if you sit down and talk to anybody at that particular institution, you will hear their vision. We are striving to be #1 in what we do. We are going to be a national leader, actually already are a national leader in many ways. But I love the fact that they've really thought through that language. And I know if I sat down with any member of their team and said, so what's different? Like, veterinary care versus exceptional veterinary care, they could tell me what that meant. And that's the kind of thing that really makes a difference when you're talking with people with enough affluence to make the kinds of gifts that can make things possible and make a real impact on your story. If we ask often enough, we're going to hear no. I've heard a number of no's. I bet there are some folks on this call who've heard no. And just a couple of thoughts to be able to deal with that. I try when I get a no to sit down and write on a piece of paper, okay, what did I learn from this no? And that's an exercise I just encourage you to do. Maybe flip something over right now if you have something to write on, and write down, last time I heard no, I used it as an opportunity to learn blank, and fill in the blank. And if you can't think of anything to put in that blank, then there's the challenge in and of itself, to think back over some of your no's and what you learned, and how that can help you and other people. When I'm actually in the moment, still with the person who said no, I try in a respectful way to learn whether the no is about the timing. Bill, I'm so sorry you don't feel you can make a leadership gift at this time. If we spread that gift out over 2 years, would that make any difference in terms of what you're thinking? Or the amount, or the project. Bill, perhaps I was mistaken. I thought you were really interested based on X, Y, and Z in our foster program, but perhaps I was mistaken. Was I mistaken in that? Ferreting out what that would be. Or heaven forbid, maybe we mistook their interest in our organization. Maybe they're really not as interested in the organization and its work as we thought. And if that's the case, a prompt no is good for business. We don't want to take their time and invest our time if we actually got that wrong. And that can happen because a lot of people who are very nice are sometimes too nice to really say, I'm really not interested in what you do. I've only had that happen a few times in my life, but I do have some instances where someone met with me up to 3 times, largely because they were doing it at the request of a friend who was a board member of mine or some other community leader. And we had to get beyond the niceness and get down to what are you really interested in, because I didn't want to take up their time when they really weren't interested. Finally, hopefully over time, we practice enough, we deal with rejection enough that we don't take no personally. But if you find that's really not you, then it's time to look for other members of your organization that can go out there and do that work and not take it personally, because we don't want you to burn out. We want you to be compassionate about yourself as well. Let's shake away the whole thought of having no for a minute and just think about, we got a yes, we got a yes. And now we move into the most overlooked and yet I think most important phase of the fundraising process, which is stewardship. Stewardship's really starting to get more attention these days, and I am so thrilled that Best Friends actually created a position and a team dedicated to stewardship. I love this quote by our director of foundation partnerships. She does a brilliant presentation on Foundations 2.0, really talking about not grants, writing a good grant, doing a good proposal, but building relationships, because as her whole team says, foundations are people too. So stewardship is really easy in some ways in terms of efficiencies, because a lot of the things you do for cultivation, you also do for stewardship. So just putting on that filter and thinking that through of all the things that we're doing, which ones are really great for stewardship, and thinking through that from that perspective can really help you identify what you want to do in terms of stewardship programs and individual stewardship. We have a recording of a great webinar that our director of stewardship did for us back in January. We have the link here if you want to go and have a look at that, if you'd like to see some of the specific tactics that she talked about. And I have an example from one of our great partners here in my photo up in Lynchburg, Virginia. I know a lot of us do the different types of honorarium and memorial tributes. We might put plaques on the wall, and we do bricks, and if we have a facility where we're able to do that. These guys decided to go to a local artist and create these fun, whimsical, to me, Dr. Seussical statues or artist works that then were planted in their celebration garden, and that's what they call it, celebration garden. And you can make a gift of X amount to honor or memorialize a person or an animal, and you'll get one of these particular sculptures and then a little plaque just below it. I love this because it also fits with the brand, with the personality of Lynchburg Humane. They're bright, they're sunny, their motto is find happiness here, and this fulfills all of that, as well as it's transportable. If they ever do move, they can pick it all up and take it with them. So it hits on a lot of different variables. We're not talking today about any kind of legal requirements, but I do just want to say a word or two about stuff, the stuff that we give donors. I see so many people spend tremendous amounts of time thinking through membership benefits, thinking through giving clubs. And if we spent half the time thinking about people and their motivations that we do thinking about stuff, we probably have stronger fundraising programs all around. So just a couple of recommendations. Please make sure somebody on your team is actually checking in both with the IRS website and then with your Secretary of State's office, so that in terms of how much you can give to people, what the value of that is as opposed to the amount of their gift, that you're on top of that, both locally and nationally. And beyond those legal requirements, go back to what I said about representing the personality of your institution or cause. Lynchburg has these lovely magnets on the right. I can put it on my file cabinet. I can put it on my refrigerator. It's bright, it's sunny, it puts me in the story. I gave happiness to a shelter pet. That is bigger and bolder than the actual giving club that's named there as Society Star, and it has their logo on it. So it hits a lot of different points of being appropriate. I went outside animal care to share a couple of examples with you on the left. next to animal care and conservation, my other big cause is education for women, particularly education for women in parts of the world where women's education is not just considered a right and a no-brainer. And I gave a gift to Bethlehem University in Bethlehem, Israel, because there you will find many young women who would not get a college education otherwise coming to that university, largely because their families, particularly their fathers, feel that their religion, whether they be Jewish or Muslim or Christian, their faith will be respected and that they will be respected and they will be safe. So it's an amazing institution, and I was lucky enough to know the gentleman that was chancellor there for many years because he had been an old music professor of mine. I made what is the largest gift I've ever made to any group. For both of those reasons, I knew someone who was a leader there, and then also it really hit all the buttons on what I cared about. And in thanking me and stewarding me as a donor, they sent me the 2 coasters that you see up on the left. And I thought that was so great in terms of the design really represents that part of the world. These are tile coasters. I use them every day. So like the Lynchburg magnet, I see it, it's practical. It just suited both the gift. It did not make me feel that they used half my gift to go buy me stuff. And it was wonderfully appropriate. That last example that I have, the little round, that's a piece of alabaster with a little piece of stone right in the center, stone that comes from that particular area. That for me fulfilled what we often refer to as the surprise and delight factor. That to me is the ultimate level of stewardship. I knew they would send me a thank you when I made my gift. I knew they might send me something small, hopefully, and appropriate and all that. But I did not expect several years down the road, because this was not a recurring gift that I made, several years down the road, when unfortunately my friend, the chancellor, passed away in a car accident, I was not able to be part of the ceremony of saying goodbye to him there at the University of Bethlehem. But the director of development, who had met me back when I made the gift, sent me her alabaster paperweight that was given to all of the people who participated in the ceremony. And when I opened that package, of course I was surprised. I was delighted. She did it because she knew about that relationship. She did it out of a sense of authenticity, but boy, did that put the university back on my radar in a major way. So thinking as you think through your stewardship, where those major donors have happened, where those that you really want to deepen and personalize that relationship, where can you create a sense of surprise and delight? It will make you stand out from the bulk of other organizations in so many incredible ways. So just a couple of final comments as we wrap this up. Once you start doing all of these things, identifying, qualifying, cultivating, you're going to need that amazing tool that we all have to use, a donor database. And I always tell people, begin where you are with what you have. If what you've got are your donor names and contacts on the back of a legal pad, that's where we start. If you're collecting that in Excel, that's where we start. But I also like to mention Stephen Covey's other effective habit, which is begin with the end in mind. So even as you're working out of a legal pad or Excel or whatever you have, start to think about what you ultimately want to track, what decisions you ultimately want to make, and what kind of information you're going to have to enter in order to make those good decisions. If you need some help with that, if you're just now thinking about getting a donor database, or maybe you want to upgrade your donor database, we are ready for you. In May, our expert, Mila Burns, is going to come on and do a webinar for us, selecting a database that's right for you. She's going to mention a number of the databases that you've heard about, not going to tell us what to buy, but going to present advantages, disadvantages, so that you can make informed decisions. And she's got some great handouts, including a chart that, boy, do I wish I'd had back when I was selecting a database for my first nonprofit job. Once you have that database and you are thinking through that fundraising process on all these different levels, you can really begin to build out or upgrade your programs. There are many different fundraising programs, as you know, and we want to help you take each of the programs that you have to a new level. So I want to end this just by mentioning some of the upcoming resources that we have for you. If you're coming to our national conference in Dallas, please think about adding an extra day and coming to our pre-conference workshop. We are bringing together our experts in annual giving, mid-level giving, our major gift folks to do an all-day workshop to help our participants create an annual plan that draws from those different sources of revenue we talked about in part one. And we really hope that you'll join us. It's going to be an incredibly robust day, and we're striving for all of our participants to leave with either a draft plan if they never had a plan, or with an upgraded plan if it's something we're going to work on. If you can't make it to the conference, or you just can't make it to that pre-day, the folks, our annual giving folks who are doing this workshop are going to do a June webinar. And of course, just that 1 hour won't be nearly as effective as that all-day workshop, but it will still give you some great insights and tools. When July comes along, we're going to have one of our plan giving experts. And if you think that plan giving is the last thing you should do because, and I've heard this so many times from people, we need money now. I just talked to a group in Fort Wayne yesterday who are able to do something they need to do now because someone put them in their will and has actually passed away, and that gift is now here, right now. So we want all our donors to live lives that are as long and as full as possible. But it is a good thing to offer people the opportunity to have a legacy that includes the work you do. It is meaningful work, and it will help add meaning to their life. So don't make plan giving the last thing you do. And if you don't know much about plan giving, do join us in July. If you really want to focus on major outright gifts, but maybe that whole conversation thing is new to you, how do I sit with someone in their office or their home and discover things about them? How do I make that solicitation? October is your month. We're going to have 2 of our major gift officers come and talk about how to have those conversations and how to move through the process with major individual givers. We have tons of foundation info already online. If that's something you're interested in, definitely ask your regional specialist or go back to part 1 and follow that link. In November, we have our Chief Development Officer whose background is in corporate fundraising. She'll be giving us kind of a tasting tea or a flight of different corporate options that people may want to explore or at least be aware of. And finally, for December, we really want to hear from you so that we can craft December's webinar around either things that rise to the top of the list because so many people want to hear about them, or maybe there's one great creative idea that just blows us away and we can build a webinar around that. All the ideas that are submitted, we'll be thinking about how to help with resources there, so don't feel like if you're not chosen for that December webinar that your idea won't be heard. We'll be hearing all of those and responding. So my last comment on process is, Trish, I really hate process. I don't want to do it. Can I raise money without this process? Yeah, you can raise some money without that process because what we do translates into lives saved, lives changed. But if you don't use the process, you tend to tip toward, over time, transactional gifts. And that's not where we want to go, right? If you use this process strategically, consciously, you will move your fundraising from transactional to transformational, especially with the institutions and the people who can make a real difference, and we will save exponentially more lives. So take a chance and let us know what's working for you. Thanks so much for being with us today. Questions? Comments?
We do have some questions, and thank you so much, Trish. So the first one came in right after we switched over a bit, but it said, what is your opinion on effectiveness of example donation gifts? So like $5 feeds a dog for a day, or $75 covers initial vetting. What is your opinion on using those?
Well, I have 2 opinions. One is testing whether that's effective with the particular audience that you have, because sometimes it matters what gift amount. I think it's always effective. My second opinion is that it's always effective to be able to package that, right? To be able to tell people, what would a gift of X do? So for me, being able to sit down with my teams and my finance person and knowing what that is and having that in my pocket is a really effective thing. It allows me to answer questions. It allows me to give examples to people as a tool where you're constantly encouraging a gift at that level, I think what you have to do is test to see whether it's effective or not with the group that you're talking to.
Okay, nice. Thank you for explaining that. And the next one's another, she's wondering what the best approach is for a corporation when you're asking for an in-kind donation, and if it's any significant difference from asking for monetary requests.
Let me answer that in a couple of ways.
Okay.
First, I'd love to hear the webinar that we're going to do in November. We'll come back to and ask Valerie that question because I'd love to have her input on that. I think there is somewhat of a difference, and it's just that for a lot of corporations, if what you're asking for is something they have access to anyway, it may be a little easier to say yes to. You know, there was a time when corporations had fairly deep pockets of philanthropic money, and that time has pretty much gone away. That's not to say you can't still get cash gifts from organizations, but the emphasis that shareholders have placed on turning a profit has made that harder. And actually, all our ability to do marketing has made it harder as well, because now most corporate gifts are tied to something. They're tied to being visible with an audience, a demographic that they need to be visible with. And you can see that with organizations like, well, I used to work for AARP Foundation, and anybody that has anything to sell to that particular population of 50 plus is really interested in supporting AARP's foundation. It's harder to get individual gifts to that particular organization, but corporate, and this is not true of most organizations, corporate donations are much easier to get because they can see the connection between marketing. So I think a good way perhaps to start building a relationship with a corporation, depending on whether you really need what they can actually provide, is to think about an in-kind gift. But I wouldn't be afraid to also ask them for a cash gift, either sequentially or if it's the right thing from the get-go to ask for both. There again, knowing the corporation, knowing what they're interested in, knowing what their objectives are, and then tailoring the ask to that is going to be the key.
Great. All right, and I think this will be our final question that we have come in to be respectful of everyone's time. But this final one came in from Sherry, and she says she knows some donors like to see little to no expenditures for administration expenses. So she was wondering if there are other ways to express or demonstrate good stewardship of donations when it comes to applying for grants or asking for donations in person.
Help me with one phrase, Rhea. Good ways to show, repeat that again for me.
Yeah. Are there other ways to express, like earlier you were showing the gifts and like the thank yous. Do you have other ways you could express or demonstrate good stewardship when applying for grants and asking for donations, but that require minimal administration expenses for donors who don't really want to see that happening?
Yeah, I can give you one example of something, and you can kind of riff off that as you're thinking about your own area. To me, stewardship is a mix of gratitude and showing impact. So thinking through how can I show gratitude and how can I show impact. A friend of mine is a theater director who keeps his list of donors who made donations when the new theater was being built and each seat was being not sold, but each seat was being offered as an opportunity for donors. And he regularly makes a habit of going to productions, particularly when school children or other special groups there, and he makes phone calls, he sends emails, he looks to see what's going on in the seats of 3 or 4 donors, 3 or 4 at a time, that's all he does. And then reaches out and says in that email or phone call, hey Trish, I happened to walk through the production of Midsummer Night's Dream the other night, and there was this little girl sitting there in the 3rd seat, the one that you and Pete supported and sponsored, and when Puck hit the stage, her face just lit up. That's a demonstration of both impact and gratitude that is priceless, right? Just like those commercials that walk through saying, and the big finish is, and this is priceless. So those intangible ways of showing people what impact they've made and also expressing gratitude are what I think we need to focus on. And you'll know what those are as you think about your particular cause and the things that you do and what the donors are interested in, and then building that out.
Awesome. Thank you, Trish. That was a great example. And we are at our time now. So I just want to say thank you again, Trish, for the wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone for joining us. As a reminder, you are able to rewatch all of these webinars that we host. They're available on our website, the network.bestfriends.org, and resources. It'll also be emailed to you tomorrow. You can also sign up for some of the future webinars that Trish mentioned on our website as well under the events tab. So we really hope you'll join us. If you do rewatch them and you have questions, please feel free to email us, or you can ask us in our Best Friends Facebook group, and you'll get even more advice most likely from your fellow network partners. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you again at a future webinar.